good to see you today. Hope you're having a good day. This week, as we get started, we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we're going to be reading the first 11 verses. So let's get over there and let's get into it. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. To look at our passage and a few things that I thought we might consider today in our brief time together, we're going to think about looking backwards. And this is in the context of 3 or 4 chapters that are all about self-denial, self-control, the idea of denying oneself. It's in the context of liberties and thinking about our brethren, as the Corinthians needed to be thinking about their brethren. And all this, I hope you see as we go along how the thread of unity and the quarrels that are mentioned in chapter 1 that had been reported by Chloe's household, all of this ties together as much as we try to, as much as perhaps I dissect them, or seemingly so, it's all, the issues are interwoven. Okay, so here in chapter 10, within the context of all this, he goes back and he looks backwards. And the idea is very much the phrase that we have today: those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And this is what the Corinthians have to do. While granted, the majority of them are Gentiles, they're going to be relying on their Jewish brethren to remind them, to remind themselves about what had happened in the Old Testament, what had happened to Israel, as it says later on in the chapter, Israel in the flesh. And they were going to have to look, backwards, is what they were going to have to do as they went forward. Sometimes it's not a good idea to look backwards. There's a verse about whoever puts his hand to the plow and looking back is not fit for the kingdom. Well, that's the idea, sort of like of Lot's wife, who looks back towards Sodom and she's struck dead, turns into a pillar of salt. Some ways you're not supposed to look backwards, especially not with a longing, and a longing for the world. So in that case, you have to look forwards. But at the same time, you better learn from what has happened historically. And that's why I say you got to learn from history. You have to look at Israel in the flesh. And you have to look and you have to see what happened. These things were written for us. It happened to them as examples. They become examples, but it was written for us. It was not written for them. God was dealing with them in the patriarchal age, in the Mosaic age. God was dealing with them hands-on, and they become our examples. It's written for us. I've heard Christians say before, why do we need to study the Old Testament? This is why we need to study the Old Testament. It's written for our admonition, so that we can learn from history, so that we don't make the same mistakes. Because that's very much the context of chapter 10. They made some mistakes, Israel in the flesh. It started off okay, though. Let's look at the passage, because all were saved. All were saved in the sense of all came out of bondage. All came out of bondage. All came out of Egypt. Right? All our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. All ate the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual rock. And that rock that followed them was Christ, showing that Jesus did not get his beginning with the virgin birth, frankly. Talking about the pre-incarnate Jesus. So anyway, but they all came out of Egypt. They all were saved from bondage. This is the point. Or I should say this. The Corinthians, chapter 1. Granted, Paul says, I'm thankful that I didn't baptize any of you. But in chapter 12, he's going to use the same language. For as the body is one and has many members, but all the members of that one body being many are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body. By one Spirit we were all baptized into one body. And it's not the body of Moses, it's the body of Jesus. All the Corinthians, all the members of the church in Corinth, all had responded to the Lord's calling. They were the called out. All were saved. They had turned from their sins. They had started off well. Paul says, as a wise master builder, I've laid the foundation. All were saved in Israel. But most were lost. And the Corinthians needed to take this very seriously, and we need to take this very seriously. All were saved, Israel in the flesh. All were saved from bondage, but how many of them made it into the promised land? Not very many. With most of them, God was not well pleased. And I want you to see why. Because you have 3 or 4 instances here, as it talks about, it says, bodies scattered in the wilderness, verse 6 is where it begins. That we should not lust after evil things as they lusted. And do not become idolaters as they did. And not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. Nor tempt Christ. That business about tempting Christ, that was when they were saying, our soul loathes this worthless bread, talking about the manna. The bread that God had supplied with them, the food that God had supplied. When they all complained, saying, we don't have any food, the Lord sends the manna. And eventually it gets to the point where they despise the manna. And this passage says that in doing that, they were tempting Christ and complaining. That's what they did. And you just go through that list and you just ask yourself, are the Corinthians making the same mistakes? Lusting after evil things, becoming idolaters, committing sexual immorality, despising the bread of heaven. You might think about what's going to be spoken about, because I think we're starting to lay the groundwork for chapter 11's discussion on the Lord's Supper. They were profaning the bread and body of Jesus. They were despising the bread of heaven. That's what they were doing. And they were complaining. Quarrels. They didn't like how they were led in the Old Testament. The Corinthians are making the same mistakes. They were judging Paul. They were despising the apostles as some of the things they were doing, especially Paul. His speech is contemptible. His bodily presence was weak. They didn't like how they didn't like how they had been led, so they preferred their own leaders, frankly. Is the idea, complaining. Anyway, you get the idea. Why was most of Israel in the flesh lost? For the same reason that the Corinthians were in danger of being lost. We have to look backwards. We have to learn from history, and we have to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes. We have the benefit, because guess what? Now we don't, as we look backwards, we don't just learn from what happened to Israel in the flesh. We also get to learn what was happening with Corinthians. And hopefully third time's the charm as we apply these things to ourselves. And hopefully we learn the lesson. We learn from history. These things are written for us. All were saved, but a lot of folks fell away. Appreciate you tuning in. Hope you have a good day. Hope the week goes well for you as we get going on this Monday. Appreciate you studying with us, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Thanks for being with us today.